Well, my name is Paul Levinson, and thanks for coming to this reading. I'm going to be reading for you from my short story, It's Real Life. It was published a couple of months ago. You can read it actually for free on a site called Vocal, that's VOCAL. So if you enjoy the reading and you want to actually see the story in the flesh or in printed words, you can just go to Vocal, search on my name and search on It's Real Life, and you can read the story. I should also mention that this is a short story, but I am now developing a novel called It's Real Life. And that will consist of this short story and a bunch of interrelated stories and chapters. So let me call up the story. Here it is, and let's begin. That's Real Life from the Beatles' 1985 Come and Go LP, and I'm Pete Fornatel on WFUV's July 4th, 1996 week-long celebration. Pete sighed with a mix of all kinds of deep emotions as the song played. Every time he played that song, every time he heard it, he felt like crying, and his eyes burned right now. The song was not only heart-tugging and beautiful, but profoundly unsettling, and he felt that he, Pete Fornatel, the disc jockey, was somehow connected to it. The Beatles were close to breaking up. Lennon had made that clear in his long interview with Pete's colleague, disc jockey Dennis Elsas, earlier this year. McCartney had too, in what he had said about his solo song, My Brave Face, co-written and co-performed with Elvis Costello. The first time any Beatle had done that with a non-Beatle, but no, that was not the reason Pete felt this unspeakable sense of foreboding about the Beatles, about Lennon in particular. The last part of that song rang in his ears. It's real life, it really is. Yeah, Pete put another piece of vinyl on the turntable. That was still his favorite way of playing music. Here's one of my all-time favorites, he said. George's All Things Must Pass from the Beatles' 1994 Band on the Run LP. They brought in Nicky Hopkins to play piano on that one. Pete hoped the song might make his foreboding pass. Instead, it only made it worse. Pete looked at the stained analog clock on the wall. He had just 12 minutes left to his show. Maybe he'd take a walk in the tunnels below Keating Hall at Fordham University. That had always cleared his mind. When he first started walking there, back when he was a student here at Fordham University in the 1960s. And he found it cleared his mind now too, since he'd returned to Fordham and WFUV about 2 years ago. No one knew exactly when or why the tunnels had been built, likely near the end of the 19th century in one of Fordham's many expansions, so students could go from one building to another without getting frostbitten in winter or drenched in the spring. There was a rumor that Edgar Allan Poe had something to do with constructing these tunnels, and one of the tunnels did go straight to his home up on Kingsbridge Road. Well, not likely that Poe had actually constructed them or had anything to do with their construction, but who knew? Poe's cottage on Kingsbridge Road off the Grand Concourse definitely was real. On this Tuesday after July 4th, the tunnels were danker than usual. but Pete didn't mind. He was kindly disposed to the fungus or lichen or whatever it was on the walls, and he found the dankness was part of their charm. There were all kinds of stories about what existed, what could be done in the tunnels, ranging from ghosts to teleportation portals to Pete's favorite. He'd encountered it in a science fiction story written by a professor in the communications department a few years ago about how the tunnels actually were conduits to alternate realities. Pete felt vaguely relieved. The very thought of alternate realities somehow made him feel better. Maybe he could get to an alternate reality where he wasn't plagued by this inchoate feeling of dread about John Lennon. He'd been thinking so hard, he'd walked a little further than he'd intended in the tunnels. He didn't recall seeing that thick wooden door before. There were plenty of them here and there in the tunnels, but they always were locked. He once asked a maintenance guy in Keating what was behind them, and the guy had said, cleaning supplies. This one wasn't locked. Maybe someone on the maintenance crew had left it open accidentally or because he was in the middle of a job. Pete couldn't resist. He opened the door. All he saw in front of him was another tunnel with no sign of cleaning supplies. Pete walked through the door and in the tunnel beyond for a few minutes. He saw nothing unusual, same mottled walls and the occasional door bolted shut. He looked at his analog watch. He'd been in these tunnels too long and realized he was now in danger of coming late to his appointment with the WNET people, which was set to begin in just an hour. The meeting was important. They wanted Pete to host a retrospective on the Beach Boys. They were another one of his favorite groups. Pete looked back on where he'd been walking. He needed to find a faster way out of here so he could catch either Conrail or Fordham's Ram van downtown, depending upon where he was able to exit. Pete knew there was more than one exit. He'd used multiple exits ever since he started walking here in the 1960s, and there was one. A different kind of door, not bolted. With any luck, there would be a steep flight of stairs upward on the other side. And there was. Pete sprinted up the stairs so fast his legs hurt. He opened the door to a soft rain. It wasn't bad. He squinted and saw he was on the west end of the campus. All right, it would be Conrail to Manhattan. Pete had no idea what its schedule was, but the trains ran pretty often. He walked quickly past Duane Library towards the train station. Pete loved that old library with its winding steps to shelves overcrowded with books. He heard a train in the distance and quickened his pace. It was definitely coming from the north. It would be close, but Pete was good at catching an arriving train. He knew he could pay on board. He dashed past the ticket booth, nearly collided with an elderly woman, and apologized over his shoulder. He rushed down the stairs to the tracks just as the train came into the station. Pete walked through the open doors and smiled. He always really enjoyed these last-minute boardings. He sat on one of the worn cloth seats and awaited the conductor. A woman soon approached in a tight uniform and a book of tickets. Grand Central Terminal, Pete told her. She nodded. $5, she said. Pete gave her a $5 bill, and she reciprocated with a ticket stub. As she walked away, Pete noticed that it said Metro North on the back of her uniform. He hadn't seen that before. It usually just said Conrail. The train arrived at Grand Central about 20 minutes later. A group of buskers caught his ear and eye. Three young women were singing Yes It Is. Please don't wear red tonight. It was one of Pete's most beloved Beatles songs. He looked again at his watch. He'd made good time on the train and had a few minutes to spare. He took another $5 bill from his wallet and placed it in the open guitar case, which already had plenty of bills and coins. The women finished the song with the word true in lovely, lilting harmony. Thank you, the lead singer, a woman with long blonde hair, said to him. The other two were blind. The three reminded Pete of the Bangles. You were wonderful, Pete said. Do you do requests? The lead singer nodded. How about real life? Pete asked. The woman scrunched her face. You mean real love? I think I read in Rolling Stone that Real Life was the original name of the song. Pete shook his head and laughed. He'd read every issue of Rolling Stone and had never seen any article or review or interview that said that. He certainly didn't want to insult these singers and tell them he was Pete Fornatale, and he no doubt knew much more than they did about the Beatles. Okay, well, could you play me that song then? Pete asked. The women nodded and began singing. Exactly the same as Real Life, except they were now singing, It's Real Love. Thank you, Pete said when they were finished and impulsively reached into his wallet. All he had was a $10 bill and a $20 bill. He put the 10 into the open guitar case with a flourish. You deserve it, he said. Isn't that President Reagan? One of the women asked. Pete nodded. When did they change the guy on the money? One of the other women asked. Alexander Hamilton's on my $10 bills. Pete didn't know what to say. He looked at his watch. If he stayed here much longer, he'd be late for his appointment. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and called one of the WNET people he was supposed to meet. The phone rang and rang and rang with no answer and no voicemail. He put the phone back in his pocket. He didn't really care about the pictures on the money. He cared about WNET, but he cared most about the Beatles. Can you tell me all you know about that song? He asked gently. The women looked at each other. The first one he had talked to looked up at him and considered. You gave us $5 of real money. Even if the $10 isn't real, I guess your $5 is worth a few minutes of conversation, she said. Thank you, Pete said. When did you last hear that song, if I could ask? I saw the video on MTV the other night, one of the women said. It was very moving. I don't think I've seen that, Pete said. What did you find moving about it? I mean, with Lennon and all, it was very emotional, she said. Yeah, Pete said. John always has a voice that pulls at your heart. And seeing him come back to life on that video, on this song, it was really something. One of the other women who hadn't spoken before said. There was something like tears in her eyes. Pete opened his mouth to say something, but stopped. This was getting crazier by the minute. What do you mean, come back to life? He asked slowly. Something happened to John Lennon that he somehow hadn't heard about? Impossible. Now all three women looked at him with expressions from suspicious to amazed. He was assassinated in 1980, right? The woman with the long blonde hair finally asked him in a husky voice. No, I don't, he thought to himself. To the buskers, he said, look, thank you. You have a lot of talent. Apologies for my interruption. He opened his wallet for the $20 or thought the better of it. He might need it for other things. He reached in his pocket and found 2 quarters. Thanks, he said again and put them in the guitar case. They had George Washington on them. They're real, right? All 3 women nodded. Thanks, Pete said again, and he hurried away. There had to be a bookstore with an encyclopedia in or near Grand Central. Pete found a Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue. He walked as quickly and inconspicuously as he could to the reference book section. He picked up a World Encyclopedia and turned to the Beatles. Oh my God. He felt sick to his stomach. The women were right. It said here that John Lennon had been shot to death in December 1980. Pete frantically picked up another encyclopedia and opened it to the Beatles, and then another and another. God almighty, same thing, same thing. What the hell was going on? Pete half sat, half collapsed on a plush chair and pondered what to do. The air conditioning felt too cold. He realized he'd broken out into a cold sweat. He was going crazy. He felt weak. He hoped he wasn't having a heart attack. He was in no condition to see the WNET people now, even if he wanted to, which he didn't. The best thing was to return to what he knew, Fordham University, where all of this had started. Or maybe it had started when he'd encountered the girl group who looked like the Bangles and sang like the Beatles. Pete wasn't sure. No, he was. This losing his mind was all a piece of when he had played real life on his show. That had unnerved him, as it always did. He walked through the tunnels for some peace. He'd taken the train to Grand Central Station, and then this. Whatever it was not peace. He needed some caffeine or maybe a drink. Yeah, that would calm him down. But no, he needed a clear head. He needed some coffee. Thank goodness they were now serving it here. He got up shakily, tried to relax, walked carefully to the coffee bar. He ordered a coffee, jet black. He took out his wallet, took out his $20 bill, and had another jolt of anxiety. He hoped the woman behind the counter didn't think this was funny money, like the singers in Grand Central Station did about his tent spot. If she did, he might not only be unable to pay for this coffee, how would he pay for the ticket back to Fordham? He had an American Express card at home, but he didn't like to use it. He looked at his $20 bill. Andrew Jackson was on it. He took his coffee, gave the bill to the cashier. He shut his eyes and prayed. Here's your change, sir, she said. Are you okay? Pete smiled. Yes, fine, thank you. Of course he wasn't okay. Not by a long shot. But at least he'd have no problem getting back to the Bronx and maybe sorting this out. At least he hoped so. He sat at a small table and sipped. And I think I will end my reading of the story right there. Hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to find out what happened, again, you can read the story free of charge on Vocal, VOCAL. Search for the story. It's real life. And my name and the story will come up. And eventually, with any luck, maybe next year by this time, there'll be a novel with that title, with this story, and a whole bunch of other alternate reality stories relating both to the Beatles and Fordham University. Thanks again.